But the new atheists are just sort of following along the Enlightenment rationalism of the previous few centuries. And with the calling of the First Vatican Council towards the end of the 19th century, the end of the 20th century, you have the emphasis on responding to these Enlightenment critics who say God's existence can't be proved. And so you have the document Dei Filius, which says that God's attributes and God's existence can be known by reason. Okay, so this is the air that we're breathing, okay, because many Catholics from there, especially us traditional Catholics, love reading guys like Garrigou-Lagrange, love reading the guys that are emphasizing and going against this Enlightenment project. But what has ended up happening, it seems to me, is there has been a slight overemphasis on reason and the fact that, yes, man can prove that God exists and he can demonstrate his attributes, can show what God's attributes are. But not everybody's going to be able to do that. And when you try to do that, it's going to take a while. It's going to be riddled with a bunch of errors, like Thomas. This is all what Thomas says. And not everybody has the leisure and the time to be able to do that sort of thing. So moreover, reason can't really discover who God is. In a certain sense, it's sort of limited by the senses. Nothing's in the intellect, which is not first in the senses. So it's sort of limited by the creation itself. Yeah.
Can I comment on that? Reason can't know God because it's similar to why I can't, like, I can know that when I met my wife, not back when I met her just as a woman, I saw her. I knew she existed. I saw what she looked like. I saw some, just from a distance. But did I know her heart? Did I know her mind? Did I know everything she'd been through in her life? No, not in a million years. And even if I went and asked her friends and I found her diary and I read through that or whatever creepily, I still wouldn't be able to know her heart and her mind. And this is part of the whole thing of studying theology is not just a discipline where you're trying to take apart an onion, because at a certain point, God needs to show us, to impart that reality to us. This is part of the philosophy of mind, which I think actually a lot of atheists are really into. They're like, oh, how do I know that Chris Plance's mind exists? Oh, I can't prove it through logic. Well, I have to do this sort of existential thought, and then I can come to some greater reality. Well, in the Catholic understanding, yeah, I can know that God exists, but in terms of knowing what's at the heart of God, that's something that only God can give us, that only we can receive through that revelation, which we did talk about last week in regards to theology, that this component of faith is given to us. We have to receive it. Yeah.
Yeah, no, that's absolutely right. And I love the way you put that, because I didn't even think I was going to put it that way, but now I'm going to recalibrate and put it the exact way you said. So we're in a position in which we're really actually, Thomas says in the Summa Contra Gentiles that if man were left to his reason, he would remain concerning the things of God in the, quote, blackest shadows of ignorance. Right. Those are intense words coming from someone who we prize as someone who has shown that the Catholic faith is compatible with reason, in the sense that there's a synthesis between faith and reason, which is what he is the master of fundamental theology. And yet here he is saying that when it comes to knowledge of God, reason remains in the blackest shadows of ignorance, unless, as you said, God reveals something to us. God has to reveal it to us. And that's where we need to pause. This is why Thomas was not a philosopher, because he recognized, not merely a philosopher, he recognized the limits of reason, that you remain in the blackest shadows of ignorance, and that reason must be, as Pope Benedict emphasized, in a state of openness, ready to receive revelation when it comes to us. Now, the question is, how has that revelation come to us? If God exists and we know his attributes, we ought to be doing what? We ought to be looking for his presence and actions in history. And so that's exactly what we find. God working through a certain group of people called Israel, the family of Israel, in which he's revealing himself to us. And so now, when this happens, for Thomas, it's not merely something that's added on to reason. it's also something that's seeping into his reason and purifying it of all errors. This is why he'll oftentimes just cite scripture when he's asking a philosophical question about God. He'll cite scripture as his answer, and then he'll show that reason has been purified by Isaiah 40 whatever, and he's not proof texting. He's just allowing the revelation of God to help purify his reason and reason come into conformity with it. So let's transition now. So that's what we talked about last time. So if scripture really is the primary text, the text for theology, how should we approach scripture? And let me say a couple things about approaching scripture. First of all, scripture does not read like a philosophical text. Okay. There's an author out there, I won't mention his name, but there's an author out there who just published a book. And in the book, he's basically arguing that Paul had failed in his Areopagus speech, essentially. And it wasn't until St. John came that you have St. John's fourth gospel, in which now John is trying to reach out to the Greeks. And he bases this off of the idea in the first 3 lines of John's gospel. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. He was in the beginning with God. All things were created through him. And so God, in Greek, he's using the word logos, in the beginning was the logos, and the logos. And so, this author sort of steps back and he's like, okay, logos, like this is, he's trying, he realized that you can't, in a recent interview with Pat Coffin, this guy said, you can't go to the Greeks and use, you try to explain, the gospel with endless Hebrew genealogies and so on
Yahweh
and so forth.
Or whatever. Yeah.
Right. And so he's trying to make the case that, you're supposed, John's gospel is basically recognizing that the Greeks aren't going to get it with the whole Jewish story. So therefore you gotta begin and even sort of show that it's the logos that, Heraclitus and all these others were talking about it. It's the fire that Heraclitus thought was the logos and stuff. And it's just, it's reading the scriptures like a philosophical text. In fact, the author thinks that, the philosophy is the context for John is writing to a philosophical audience, and nothing could be further from the truth. Nothing could be further from the truth. And that needs to be dealt with as a side issue. By the very fact that logos there is just the translation of wisdom in the Old Testament. But he's not going to use Sophia. We know Sophia as wisdom, but John's not going to use Sophia because Sophia is the feminine. He has to use the masculine, which is logos. And in the Old Testament, the Greek Septuagint, logos and Sophia are used interchangeably. Okay, so here's the thing. In Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John's gospel especially, and everything in the New Testament, the assumption is that that Jesus is the fulfillment of everything that God had promised to Israel. Jesus only makes the sense he does from within the story of Israel. And if you try to say, as often many people do in the church today, that Jesus is the fulfillment of everything that Aristotle, Plato, and Socrates said, you will literally never understand Jesus, period. There's no possible way. There's no possible way. Plato's not cited. Socrates isn't cited. He's not even referenced. There's no hint of it there. It's not as if they're not aware of it, the New Testament authors. But when they went out there, the reason the Hebrew genealogies were important was because God made promises to David, and God made promises to Abraham, and through Abraham, Judah in 49, Genesis 49, and then through Judah to David. And so the idea that the gospel can somehow be preached purely to a philosophical audience is on philosophical grounds is absolutely absurd. There is no way that you can understand anything about the gospel, anything at all, by without referencing the genealogies and therefore by telling the much larger story of Israel.
Yeah. Can I interject here? I think there's a good analogy maybe that might get this across. And I know analogy might sometimes
they always break
make it more obscure, right? But I think we can make it simpler. Like if I know, I don't know, who was your favorite baseball player growing up? Mark McGwire. You kind of look like him. If I like Mark McGuire for his great baseball skills, and I think I know him, or I think that the best way to study him is just look at the back of his baseball card. And now I know him. I know him completely. That's like the philosophers. That's like any philosopher trying to study Christ and say, Jesus was just a really good mind, a very wise man. And so when I read the scriptures, I'm just going to look at him as solely a philosopher. But what we're saying is, if you look at Mark McGuire as just a baseball guy, you don't know he's got kids, he's got a family at home, he's got all these things he has behind the scenes. And the same goes for Christ. It's even deeper with Christ, because in terms of genealogy, the Jews, the people of Israel, put great emphasis on who your parents were, who your mother, your father, your lineage, all that, because that had a lot to do with your role in this world, how you were raised. And then I think that's maybe that helps. I don't know if that does or not, but
yeah,
that's how I see it. That's what
absolutely. It's the much larger context is sort of what I'm trying to get at, which is that, Jesus comes as Israel's Messiah. We call him Jesus Christ, and that Christ is not his last name. It's a title. It's a title of Israel's Messiah. It's the anointed one, who was coming as the king. I mean, the gospel is literally, as Tolkien describes it in Lord of the Rings, it's literally about a king coming back to Middle Earth, to Earth, and taking back his kingdom, his world, from the Dark Lord. I mean, that's how the story actually works. In Genesis 3, you have the abdication of our duty to be the rulers of this world, and therefore the Dark Lord takes it over, and then he is the one running the world for the most part. We are his children, his slaves. And then you have Christ, the promised seed of Genesis 3:15, the promised seed of Genesis 12, the promises of Abraham, the promised seed to David in 2 Samuel 7, the promised Messiah of Isaiah, and bringing about the promised kingdom of Daniel 2-7, 2-9. And these are all promises. This is the context for why Jesus is saying and doing what he's saying and doing. And and this brings me to a second point that I'm now remembering. The other second point is, I find among Catholics, and I talk to James about this a lot, this love for G.K. Chesterton, and love for J.R. Tolkien's Lord of the Rings, and love for C.S. Lewis's Chronicles of Narnia. And I totally get it. But sometimes I feel like for every 20 articles on Lord of the Rings at like some Catholic blog or news thing, there's one article on, Isaiah 40-55 or the scriptures. And this is among specifically traditional Catholics. And when I talk to people who I know love Lord of the Rings, but can't get into scripture, I've realized it has nothing to do with like intentions. These are faithful Catholics who love the Lord, but their eyes glaze over when they go to scripture, because they're like, this is so, and what I've tried to do with my Bible studies and with my patrons that I have is I think I finally realized why it's so tough. It's tough because